Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to episode 251 of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where today I talk to Theresa Sigillito Hollema, about leading virtual global teams. So I've known Theresa now for a while. I met her actually through the community virtual team talk, and we have spent a lot of time talking about writing, and we have also spent a lot of time talking about working in teams, in virtual teams specifically. And of course, her specialism is global teams because she looks at geographical culture, at how people who live in different spaces can collaborate, can work together well. So she was in a previous episode, and actually I think she also contributed to an episode we had on World Book Day, I think it was called. Listeners, time goes so fast, and this year has just warped the whole of time and the sense of time. But anyway, her book is Virtual Teams Across Cultures, Create Successful Teams Around the World. And it was the recommended book in our last newsletter, which reminds me, this show is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant. We have a newsletter you can sign up to if you go to virtualnotdistant.com/newsletter. And when you sign up, we have now the guide to visible teamwork, the guide to leading through visible teamwork, introducing asynchronous communication in your team. So you can download that when you sign up to the newsletter. If you have read that, then please let me know. Let me know what you think. If it's of any use, if it's useful, it's a set of principles that hopefully you can apply in your team. And by the way, if we haven't met before, my name is Pilar Orti. I'm the director of Virtual Not Distant, where we're helping people transition to an office optional approach. And I think what we're doing now is helping people consolidate, discover what they've learned over the past few months. It's mid-October 2020. Reflect on what they've learned. Think about what has worked for them, think about how they want to be working in the future, and we help them to design those practices. There used to be a time when it was about helping that very planned transition, but of course now everyone's doing it, and now we're thinking, well, how do we do this? And I've also been working with an organization recently who is introducing the office back in. So looking at which ones of the principles of being a remote team or even a remote organization, what principles can we now adapt so that it doesn't matter if some of us are in the office or not. So hopefully we'll bring back the optional into office optional soon. But before that, we're here for whatever you need. But I think enough about me, enough about us for now. I'll leave you with the conversation with Theresa, and I will be back after the conversation. Well, I'm super happy today to have at the other end of the line, and we managed to make Skype work, Theresa Hollema, who is an author, not just an author, but the author of Virtual Teams Across Cultures, Create Successful Teams Around the World. A wonderful book. I thoroughly recommend it. And she's also the director of Interact Global, and I will ask her to tell us what she does through that company in a second. She's also been a guest on the show previously, and she is someone who I've turned to in moments of writing despair. So Theresa, welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast.
Hey, Pilar, good morning. It's really great to speak with you again.
Yes.
Always.
And this time we're recording, so just remember
Yeah.
that others can hear us. So I've been following again your journey writing the book, and I was waiting for the day when the book was published and you could come onto the show and talk to us. We're only going to look at one or two, of course, of the ideas that are in the book. But I'm delighted to have you here and to share you with the listeners. So I suppose it'll be interesting to hear so what it is that you do with Interact Global and how did you end up doing that also? Question.
Great. Well, yeah, it's always good to talk to you, Pilar. So what I do with Interact Global is I'm a cultural consultant, team coach, and I focus on working virtually. So I started many years ago in the business world. I'm an American and now I'm living in the Netherlands, and I came over for a business project. But for me, what was always interesting was that cultural aspect. How do people who are coming from different cultures, have different ways of working, come together? And so about 15 years ago, I became a cultural consultant. But then I noticed you can only go so deep on that topic. And I wanted to go deeper with teams. So then I studied to become a team coach. And 7 years ago, about that time, clients were starting to say, you know what, we're working across cultures and we're working in teams, but we're doing it virtually. Can you help us to understand this? And so at that time, I went deeper into that topic as well. And I brought all three of those together, culture, teams, and working virtually, into this book, Virtual Teams Across Cultures. And so I'm a consultant, trainer, team coach, facilitator, helping people who are working across cultures and working virtually to understand what this means, because it's different than working on site together.
Yeah, that's such a great point that culture, of course, we bring our own culture to our work and our personality, etc. And then when you put tech in the mix and physical distance, and I suppose the perception of physical distance also, then that adds another layer.
You're spot on. It really does. And what's interesting is that we don't expect that. I mean, my neighbor is surprised that I can sell this book or that I even wrote a book because I'm never traveling anymore. And he thinks, well, if she's not traveling, is she working across cultures? And the answer is yes. Like you said, we bring our cultural selves to the virtual space, and that distance even impacts us as well, and how we think about our colleagues and how we want to work with them as well. So if we don't understand that, then we just assume everyone's like us because that's what we are experiencing. But in fact, culture does impact virtual teams, and developing cultural competence is quite important when you're working virtually.
And of course, this kind of virtual teams are not new. In fact, I think this is the first kind of virtual team or teams that communicate through technology that we've had, isn't it? Because that's why there were virtual teams, because we were in different locations, usually of multinationals. But I do think also, and of course I defer to you, that point of addressing the cultural aspects and how that was affecting how we worked was not looked into, because I always said, like, we have problems with this and that, but actually we when we talk, we have to talk about the work because we're usually away from each other, and sometimes these virtual teams are project teams. So maybe that was missed.
So there's a couple of things I'd like to respond to what
Go
you
for
said.
it.
First is got a lot of different angles. First is we have quite a few books and quite a few research on working across cultures. That's been, let's say, for 30 years now, an important topic. And we have quite a few books, including many of yours, that are focused on working virtually, but very few that bring them together. Because as you're suggesting, that is actually the reality of many teams, not all, but many teams that are working virtually globally, is that they're working across cultures. So now the next question is, well, how deeply are they working together? Because it's about the work, as you're suggesting. So if, for instance, there's very low interdependence, there's not very much going on, but one location is sending documents to another location, or the complexity is quite low, then actually maybe we don't need to understand how each other works. We can be separate and just share information. However, if there's high interdependence, if there's a lot of complexity in the deliverables that we must do, if we need to create together, then understanding how each other works, understanding each other's point of view, And understanding cultural diversity as well as the other diversity on the team is actually quite critical for the success, I think.
In which ways then do we differ that will affect how we're working together? And also from the point of view of the team leader who is thinking about, okay, how do we not just work well together, but also how do we make this matter? How do we create a sense of belonging in the team so that people actually are not just worried about working together, but do feel some kind of affiliation to the team?
So for the first part of your question, or what are some differences? So many people probably are already familiar with some subtle differences, for instance, in the way we communicate. Some cultures are more direct, some cultures are more indirect. And the reason we communicate can be quite important to understand. So for instance, some cultures we are very segmented in the way we think about things. In some cultures, we're much more holistic in the way we think about things. Another example is how we think about virtual meetings. What's the purpose? Some cultures think, hey, like for instance, Scandinavia or Sweden or the Netherlands or America, we come to a meeting because we want to make a decision. Whereas other cultures are saying, no, we come to a meeting to share and to listen and to understand, for instance, Japan, but we want to talk about it more after the meeting. And we want to dive deeper into some of the topics and then make a decision. So culture will show up in how we work virtually. But what can a leader do? That's a really good question. The first recommendation is to recognize that culture is part of the equation and to put attention to it. So for instance, helping the team to develop cultural competence together, taking courses together, a culture course, for instance, to understand what this means, but then having activities that put attention to the culture. So for instance, they could once a month have a different person talk about their country. But then even going deeper into how do we work? What are our assumptions when we are communicating, making decisions, engaging with other stakeholders, having these real conversations that we wouldn't have to have if we were working with our colleagues locally, but we need to have when we're working with people from other cultures. One more thing, if I may, because you mentioned the leader, and what we've seen in some of the research is that the leader plays a really critical role, especially as to whether the team leverages the diversity, really uses it for creativity. All these different points of view, different locations, different touch points. And what we see is if the leader believes in diversity, that plays a huge role. If the leader doesn't really believe in it and thinks it's more annoying, doesn't recognize his or her unconscious bias, for instance, then the team also doesn't give much attention to it. But as well, the leader has to give the team time to explore that diversity, to take time to understand each other's point of view. I mean, these are deep, interesting conversations, but they do take time and they do take some attention. So putting it as a priority also makes a difference on a team.
What's coming to mind also is that embracing that diversity instead of, like you were saying, instead of being worried by it or thinking that as an obstacle or a challenge, even. It was a good challenge, but also saying, okay, we've got an opportunity here to have, as you say, different ways of doing things. We can even be challenging things that maybe if we weren't in a multicultural team, like what you're saying, what are meetings for? Maybe we haven't even challenged that before, but actually, hey, having diversity allows us to challenge that and then hopefully find a way of working that, well, I wouldn't say that suits everyone in the team, but that suits the team in the best way.
Exactly. And as a team, there's a couple of things that need to be paid attention to. First is, for instance, minorities and majorities. So as you're saying, as the team develops the norms and has these conversations, the makeup of the team needs to be careful about how the makeup can influence the ultimate decisions or the norms that the team forms. So for instance, you don't want the majority to say, okay, we've had this conversation, we're just going to do it our way, because then you're squashing the expression of the other cultures as well. So if I can bring in a very common word that's being used very often now, which plays a huge role in multicultural teams, is psychological safety. That people feel invited to express themselves in the ways that they are comfortable, and that because we have cultural competence, we can hear and understand what they're saying as well.
And also just going back to, you mentioned earlier on the level of task interdependence. So how our tasks are linked to each other, and how that might affect how much attention we pay to the cultural diversity. Can you tell us a bit more about that? So how would... Let me see if I can link this, and if I'm getting it completely wrong, please go over wherever you need to go. But it's something. So you said about leveraging the diversity and also understanding what level of task interdependence we have. Could those two go together?
Let me give you an example. I'm working with a client right now.
Great.
So they are, I'm going to use different countries so that they don't identify themselves. So let's say they are in Singapore and they are in the US. And right now, they are struggling. Singapore and the US, they're struggling because the level of complexity of the customer requests and the level of complexity of the products requires that they really interact and understand each other. And what's happening is the distance is making them feel far away. So they're not feeling close to each other, and they're acting as if they're very low on interdependence, as if they hardly have to work together. So their behaviors are as if it's low interdependence, but the reality is they need to be higher. So what does this mean? This means that we need to help them to make those connections as humans, as colleagues, understand where they have the shared overlap, the shared objectives, but also understand each other's cultures, because how they work is becoming a hurdle right now because they don't know each other and they're making assumptions and they're getting frustrated. And by understanding how each other works, they can start to appreciate each other's communication style, a decision style, et cetera. But as colleagues, they can also expand and leverage some of that diversity that Singapore and the US can bring to each other as they, for instance, create solutions for their customers, which are global.
So are you suggesting that they restructure also how they work together, or is it just about having the conversations to understand how it's affecting us?
Absolutely, you're right. They have to restructure as well, and that's part of our program. Mm-hmm. So how they use the technology, how often they communicate together, how often their whole structure of sharing information, of having meetings is very much as if it was low interdependence, as if they hardly had to interact. But in fact, we need to help them to create that in place while and learning about each other more deeply.
Mm-hmm. I'm just reminded of a piece of research that Katerina Bolek-Carbonell shared recently. Now, let me see if I remember. It was a virtual team with people in the US and India, I think. And something that really helped them to feel a bit more cohesive and actually to get working together better, I think those were the outputs, was to have some catch-up conversations between them. But what really helped them was to have a guideline of what should be in those conversations. So they weren't leaving it to the people to decide what the conversation should be about, because they were seeing maybe that the two different cultures had a different approach. So they actually gave them some guidelines, and they found that helped.
That's really interesting, because I've also seen some research from Harvard, I think, that a similar situation where it was India and the US and weren't communicating, and therefore they used scripts. They called them scripts and gave some guidelines on conversations. Actually, we are doing something similar, not as script-oriented, but suggested topics. Yeah. We're organizing coffees and things like that, because it's this informal learning conversations that people aren't having. They're having the meetings and the tasks and, the agendas, but they're not understanding each other's. And through these more informal coffees, or as you're suggesting, these more script-oriented, we give them questions to start learning more and being more curious about the other, so that they have some aha moments. Okay, that's what's going on. I mean, I'm really sympathetic to teams that are struggling with this, because we have to remember we're asking them to develop cultural competence while they're sitting in their own country. If they were able to travel, for instance, to Singapore or to the US and really see and feel and taste and touch the other cultures, it might sink in, or at least that journey would start of sinking in. But now we're saying, while you're sitting in your own country, please learn how to work with these other cultures. And that takes some effort. And it takes effort not only from the individual, but I think from the team as well. There are things, putting attention towards developing this together and learning about each other goes a long way in a team.
And that's something that I hadn't thought of before. I had a conversation with you at some point. I don't know whether we were recording or not, but it was like, yeah, that is a huge difference. And that's what makes it even more difficult is that people, you're immersed in your own culture geographically and physically, and yet your way of working needs to be adapting to something else. And I wondered, Theresa, and with the pandemic, and we're recording mid-October 2020, do you think, it's just coming to mind, that even because we've been home, then maybe we've been even more immersed in our own culture and our own context, whereas before maybe we were going to an office which maybe had, it had logos and stuff that reminded us that we were in a different space and therefore takes us out of our context a little bit. But do you think it might have got more difficult, or actually we don't know?
So what I'm noticing in conversations with my clients, so we have to be really good question, because in the first couple of months, it was just, oh dear, panic. How do we make this work? And it was interesting. A McKinsey study showed that we expected to be able to work remotely would take more than 400 days. But in fact, we did it in 10 days. We had no choice, but we did it in 10 days. So everybody just said, okay, let's make this work. And we thought it would be short term, but now it's starting to be longer. And so the questions are coming up regarding how do we nourish this corporate culture that we used to have in the building? And the reason I'm bringing this up to your question, which aligns with also the work that I've done even pre-COVID, is this idea of something that we share. So this building used to be something that we shared. It was a physical entity, and we could see our colleagues. We could learn what the norms by observing, but now we can't. And that's actually the reality of what used to be, what has been in the virtual teams that have been working like this for years. So we suggest, or we notice, and we see in the research that focusing on these shared team elements, purpose, objectives, identity, shared fun that we had, the stories that we had, things that help us to identify with each other goes a long way in helping us feel like we belong to each other, even though we're not sitting next to each other. So I see that parallel happening now with the COVID situation and people working from home, is that we just continuously need to be much more explicit about what brings us together versus it used to be implicit through the building and through the structure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So on top of that, so that's an added one. That's an added one. How interesting. I just find everything fascinating, which is why I think that there's a lot of exploiting to be done with some online tools that are the tools that we can use to communicate. So it's a shame that there's a very small degree of customization that can happen to tools. For example, if I am in a Microsoft 365 account with one company, it might look exactly the same as another. And within companies, probably what something looks like for one team is the same as what it looks like with another team, because we're missing those visual cues that say, I have landed in the team space. Right. So I wonder whether that is also helps that cultural diversity as well. I don't know whether it helps. I'm going the other way. Instead of embracing it, I'm trying not to. You see what I'm doing? But I don't know. But it's really interesting because my mind is in two ways. It's okay, we embrace the diversity and we talk at it, but at the same time, I want to feel like we've got something in common. And that's where what you're talking about comes in, I think.
Pilar, you're hitting upon a concept that's really important. So I know, well done, if I can say, because you're hitting on what the different layers of belonging. And so actually, when people are participating or when they're part, let's say part of a team, there's two elements. They want to feel like they belong. So there's things that we share, and they want to feel their uniqueness. They want to feel valued for what they bring to it as well. And part of that is their cultural diversity, as well as other aspects as well. So what we see in a team, what a team leader needs to be conscious of are two concepts. One is this social identification, that we identify with the team. I'm part of this team. I have a logo, if it's possible, to put into the technology. I mean, what you just described would be fantastic to help that. So maybe I even have a plant on my desk. Everybody has the same plant, and when I look at it, I'm reminded I'm part of that team. Whatever, just these things that bring us together. So social identification, but then self-identification as well, that I feel unique, I feel valued because I'm sitting in my country and I bring these skill sets and I have these opinions and I have this experience. So both of those need to be present in order for people to really feel they belong.
Mm-hmm. Yes, nice. Okay, good. That's very clear. I can now talk about it better. As my friend,
you intuitively already knew it, Pilar.
Yes. So my friend Theresa put it so well on my podcast. So something else, and it goes along these lines. And again, I think as you were working on the book, we had this conversation, and I didn't share that I was going to ask you this because I just saw my note here from yesterday. Is this concept of creating a memory system, which I think builds on very nicely from what we're talking about. You talk about that in the book. Can you explain? And I think this is so important, this memory system in our team.
Yeah, so this is a very academic word, transactive memory system. And you're right. I remember it was you and I were speaking about this, and you're the one that pointed out this concept of memory being such a beautiful word. And I agree with you very much. It's this idea, it's how do we have a knowledge system in a virtual team? I hear so often leaders complaining that, gosh, my people are not sharing information. They don't call each other enough. I wish they would reach out. I tell them to, but they don't, this type of thing. And I think we have to understand what happens in a virtual team, multicultural virtual team. My colleague may have information that is interesting for me and that would help me, but first off, he or she is far away. So there's already this geographic distance, which can lead to a psychological distance. Then they also are in another culture. So I may be nervous about accidentally insulting them or saying something wrong. Or if I do call them, they may respond in a way that's confusing and I don't understand because our communication styles are different. So what do? I go down the hall and ask my colleague who doesn't have as good information, instead of calling the distant colleague who has better information. And this is something that a team needs to proactively put attention to. This is why understanding culture, understanding communication styles, understanding different assumptions, broadening our own way of communicating is so critical. So understanding our own cultures is critical. But then also building those connections so I know where information is and we know each other so that if I do call, it's not alarming to either of us, that it's actually very natural. And so that's why a team spending time building those connections can help a transactive memory system to come alive.
What's also coming to mind is the whole concept also of narrating your work, visible teamwork, working out loud. Is this something that can help with that, or are we talking about different things?
No, I think you're spot on. I think that could really help. I think you're more of an expert on that than I, but I see that as being very beneficial for people being able to share information and know where the different sources of information are. Because that's also part of it, right? I'm far away and you don't know what I know. You look at my resume and you don't know what those schools are. You don't know what that background is. But by using the techniques that you just mentioned, working out loud and being more visible, then people start to learn who knows what and who I can go to.
So I'm going to go into that because I have a question that I think we've talked about, but we haven't had an answer to. So maybe you can share that with the listeners. But before that, this concept, it's really interesting, this concept of physical distance, because the example you were giving about if we're co-located in a team and we're working globally across offices, then I might go to the person who's nearest to me physically, then think of how I am going to get in touch with that person who feels so far away because they are, even though we've got the internet and all this technology. And I'm wondering whether even if people are at home and not in the office now, even if more people are working from home, whether also the phone is the fastest way of communicating rather than going online and sending an email or seeing if someone else is ready for, someone else can jump on a meeting with us. I wonder whether that has done anything to reducing the sense of physical distance. Probably not.
You mean using the video more?
When we're working in offices and we have a team, maybe where some of us are in one country, others are in other countries, we do have that physical closeness with the people working in our country. However, if we've had to shift and work from home, or if we've decided now that we're working from home, now we're not next door to the other person, but they're still in the same country. So maybe we still feel like they're closer. Maybe we still reach out to them. Whereas actually we have to access everyone through technology.
When you have a situation where you have a few people in one country and a few in another and a few in another, so we call that a hybrid team. And the physical distance can lead towards towards psychological distance. And what happens is that we think of our colleagues who are far away as very abstract. So, for instance, if you think about your agenda, if you think of something in January, a date in January, you sort of know what you have to do, but it's very abstract. Whereas tomorrow, you know exactly what you need to do, where you need to be, who you need to see, et cetera. So people who are far away we consider more abstract, and people who are close by are more detailed. You know, Joe is nice, Sue is fun, and them over there are Mexican, let's say. So we use cultural stereotypes often to identify this abstract level, and it can turn into an us versus them. So what I've noticed in the Corona time is that now that everyone is at home, this issue of us versus them actually is going away a little bit, because now everyone is virtual. Nobody's sitting next to each other. Nobody's going down the hall to my colleague and saying, yeah, I don't like working with them over there either, which feeds into that us versus them. So I've heard from colleagues, and it's not surprising to me, from clients, and it's not surprising that actually there becomes a sort of an equality now that everyone is sitting in a different location. It becomes an 100% remote team, which are much easier than hybrid teams.
Yeah, and interesting also for just an aside here about language, that now the word hybrid is becoming that mixture of office and home workspace, whereas actually it's been but it's been in the remote space, whatever, virtual space and multicultural space. Hybrid has meant that some people are together in different offices, basically in different locations, working together. So there's a mixture of virtual and co-located, but in a different context. So that's also something that's very interesting, how the language has evolved with Corona. We didn't expect that.
Yeah, your point is really nice. And I wonder how we need to, I think you've just made the distinction very nicely. And we need to think about, there are overlaps, of course. As we go in the future, we can learn about these hybrid teams that we've always had and how they have made it work as we try to make it work with working from home.
Because at the end, it's the worry is the same. The worry is the silo. So it's the same. I would like to refer listeners, especially new listeners, the old listeners will have heard of it before, but we do have an episode with Mark Kilby, probably. It was an episode which also had David Burkus talking about networking, and therefore we had also Mark Kilby talking about his how he defines teams, and he calls them clusters, nebula, and satellite. So satellite is when you have the main people all working together and some people working remotely, like satellite. Then the clusters are exactly what you're talking about, what we're talking as hybrid, which are groups in same locations but working across, and then nebula, which is fully distributed. So that's also a nice language that I'd like to refer listeners to if you're looking for a different kind of language. So now my big question. So going back, so the memory system, I've just realized, because I used this in a series of workshops I was doing for a Spanish company, and I talked about memoria de equipo and how important it is to do some asynchronous work so that we are capturing that memory, mainly in the context of new people coming into the team when we are all remote. You know, how are people onboarded, having written interactions or recordings of conversations so they can hear the language used in the team, what people talk about. So all the stuff that you don't really get in an official onboarding program. So, and I've just realized that it came from this conversation, from the memory from you. So thank you for that. So we've amplified that message. Now, going back to how visible teamwork can help, which is all about having more open conversations, making the workflow visible. How does this pan out? And in fact, no. What do I have to be careful as a team leader that wants to implement some of this in a multicultural team, in a global, and especially if we're virtual and global? What are some of the cultural differences I need to be aware of? Whereas some people might be very used to, and this is also personal, but let's look at it from culture. Some people might be very used to having open conversations. They might come from a culture where forums are really popular and everyone does it. What do I need to be looking out for? Because there's going to be a different level of acceptance in talking about stuff publicly, even in the team.
So as you mentioned, I think it'll be personal as well, and especially with experience and maybe even generation, maybe even function. I mean, there's a lot of diversity there that can play a role. And I like your question regarding what could be public. So for some cultures, feedback might not be as accepted to be open as it would be, for instance, on other cultures. And of course, it depends on what the feedback is about as well. So some visible teamwork might say, yeah, the feedback is a way for all of us to learn. Whereas that kind of a mentality might not work in some cultures. So that has to be given some attention to. But as well, it's which tools to use when. Working visibly could be absolutely a part of the team that should be incorporated. And there might be, let's call it a gray area, where some people might want more human interaction, more synchronic, where others say, no, asynchronic is perfect for me at this moment. So that might be a discussion point, whereas it might have some cultural biases to it as well.
So can you do a piece of research for us on the acceptance of asynchronous communication in different cultures?
I would love to.
Listeners, if anyone wants to commission us to do that, I would love to, because that is another, this is another thing. So yeah, thank you for that. I think it is really important. And I've been called out on this on Twitter by the lovely Alon about that some of the practices that in particular, Virtual Not Distant, and in particular me, are advocating for, are not for, well, we know the personality thing, I always touch on that, but also I'm very aware that culturally they might be promoting a certain kind of Western culture, a certain kind of working. And I've really noticed this by working with Spain, because the difference has been huge. And I just think you just need to look at, I don't know. You just need to look also at social media, how it's used sometimes to see the differences, and what is common, what is acceptable, what is close to people's hearts, and all of this is important to remember, especially if it's a global team.
Very interesting, Pilar. You have a little study there, so we already have a data point. Really
yes. So I encourage listeners to, listeners, get in touch. It's always great to hear from you. Sometimes some peers are really quiet, some are a bit more busy. But virtualnotdistant.com, we have a contact form. If this is something you've been thinking about, if this is something that you have addressed, and by that I mean introducing some of this visible teamwork or more open asynchronous conversations, what you have considered, and also maybe how some team members have reacted. We'll keep everything anonymous. It doesn't matter. Or if you've seen something somewhere, you read something about this. I think it's just the next step to evaluating I'll say my own practice also. I'm always have to be doing this. We have to be embracing the diversity, not ignoring it and thinking of it as a challenge.
There you go.
which will bring me back to the where we started the conversation. Really, Theresa, I think now this is the first interview I've done in a while, so I think this is as far as I can go with my brain today. Before, as you can see, I'm starting to waffle. But is there anything else that you think we should be considering as leaders of global virtual teams, or as members of global virtual teams, or actually just as people operating in what's increasingly becoming a connected world of work?
Well, I think this is why I wrote the book, is because I do think that this is a topic, cultural diversity, leadership, how teams work, is an important topic as we go forward. And understanding culture, understanding diversity, but also most important, so learning about others, but most important is learning about oneself. How have I been influenced by the cultural diversity I have? How can I grow through my interactions with my colleagues? How do I react? What biases do I carry that I can start to address and look deeper at? So this is a learning process about the other, but more importantly, it's a learning process about oneself.
Well, that's great too. I have lots to add, but I'll leave it for another episode because it's a brilliant note. So listeners, I do thoroughly recommend Virtual Teams Across Cultures if this is of interest to you. And I think going back to why you wrote the book, Theresa, also, I do think it brings together the thinking, the questions, the literature, even on cultural differences and the online world. So I think it's a perfect marriage. Glad you did it. So Theresa Sigillito Hollema is where Theresa can be found on Twitter and LinkedIn, and Interact Global is the name of her company. So Theresa, thank you so much for spending this time with me, talking and recording it.
Thank you, Pilar. I always like talking with you. And as we continue to explore these topics together, this is all developing and we're navigating this together. So thanks for inviting me, and looking forward to next time.
Well, listeners, thank you very much for listening. Because of you, I got to chat to Theresa for another half an hour. So that was wonderful. And I hope that the conversation started to spark some thoughts. Maybe it even gave you some guidance. I don't know. It's really interesting that the focus, of course, now of communicating online and virtually is actually doesn't have a lot of this across the world connotation to it, because now a lot of us are remote from our colleagues who are physically close. I think that this notion of how physical distance affects how we think of someone is really important. It's really important that we find ways, if that is getting in the way, of reducing that. And as I said in the interview, one place is to use what we've got, that we all have access to, which is an online space. What is the best way of using that to help us to create that sense of belonging? So I will refer you to the blog posts and the episodes of the podcast that have visible teamwork as a main subject. And those are, there was a series of 3 episodes that I did back in July. So episode 239, we talk about task interdependence, which Theresa started to talk about. 241, I talk about visible teamwork and trust. And 243, I talk about motivation and visible teamwork. Maya has done a mammoth blog post which combines those 3 episodes. So if you want to read, go to the blog. If you want to listen, go to the podcast. You see, we've got a little bit for everyone. Plus, remember, if you sign up to our newsletter, you can download the PDF with the principles of visible teamwork. And listeners, if you're still listening, it means you listen to podcasts. It might even mean that you're enjoying your time here with us. So how about I tell you about the new service that we're gradually introducing in Virtual Not Distant, which is in-house podcasting. And this is all about creating a sense of belonging through regular audio that reflects the voices in the organization. So we're not talking the traditional in-house radio where it was always the same voices, usually quite senior in the organization talking. We're thinking about what are the voices that you don't want to be lost in the organization? What are the things that colleagues want to be hearing from each other? What are the learnings that are being lost that actually we could benefit from giving them 5 minutes in an episode for people to hear? And how can you create a sense of belonging away from the screen? So all of this, the answer could be an in-house podcast. I'm very happy to talk to you about what this might look like, how it might work, and whether you might be able to make the most out of it in your organization too, and whether it's the right thing. So it's perfect for amplifying culture. And by culture, we are thinking about the ways things are done here. So of course, going back to our conversation with Theresa, sometimes in countries, things are done in a certain way. In organizations, that is what culture is how things are being done here, how decisions are taken. Hello, Anish, if you're listening. I've just had a conversation with him about this. How decisions are made, how people talk to each other, what's acceptable and what's not. That's a company culture. And that can be reflected in a regular show that draws from inside the company. So talk to me, virtualnotdistant.com. Meanwhile, thank you very, very much for listening. I'm here if you need anything. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.